My life seemed like the embodiment of success. I owned a thriving business, built through years of relentless hard work, sleepless nights, and sacrifices most people wouldn't understand. It was never handed to me. I had to claw my way up with no shortcuts. Now, I was the proud owner of one of the most profitable firms in the industry, a business that had turned me into a figure of admiration and, in some cases, envy. I had a beautiful wife, Alice. She was everything a man could hope for: intelligent, elegant, and incredibly supportive. Her sense of style was impeccable, and she could command attention without saying a word. More than that, she had always been my biggest cheerleader, especially in the early days when the business was nothing more than a dream. Alice knew how to motivate me, pushing me forward when I doubted myself and standing beside me when success finally arrived. My business partner, Luke, had been part of the journey almost as long as Alice. We weren't the best of friends, but we shared a history. We met while working as waiters at a small restaurant, two young men eager to escape the grind of low-paying jobs and build something meaningful. Luke was charismatic, ambitious, and had a natural talent for winning people over. He wasn't just a business partner. He was someone I relied on, at least professionally. Over the years, we built the company together. It wasn't easy, but we made a formidable team. His charm and ability to close deals complemented my strategic thinking and work ethic. While we weren't close friends who shared personal details of our lives, we had a mutual respect for each other's business acumen. We'd often grab a drink or play a round of bowling, more out of habit than true friendship, but it worked for us. Alice always appreciated Luke, calling him sharp and charming, qualities that helped the business grow. I thought nothing of it at first. After all, Luke was good at what he did, and his confidence only added to our business's appeal. But deep down, I knew Luke had always wanted more than what he had. He was the kind of man who saw challenges not as obstacles, but as targets he needed to conquer. This ambition helped our company soar, but as I would later realize, it also made him dangerous. For years, everything seemed perfect. My hard work had paid off, and I was living the life I had always dreamed of, until subtle changes began to disrupt the flawless image I had created. It all started on a weekend getaway, a seemingly innocent gathering of friends, meant to be a break from the pressures of work. Alice and I had decided to join Luke and his wife, Sophie, for a relaxing weekend at a cabin by the lake. We rented 2 cottages, side by side, nestled in the woods. The plan was simple: barbecue, some light hiking, and disconnecting from the daily grind. The morning after we arrived, we planned to take a hike in the nearby forest. It was supposed to be a fun group activity, something to do together, but that morning, Alice complained that she wasn't feeling well. She waved us off with a weak smile, saying she'd rest. Luke, always the late riser, was still asleep when we prepared to head out. With only Sophie and me ready to go, we decided to take the walk and let the others catch up later. It was a peaceful hike, quiet, surrounded by nature. I remember feeling grateful for the stillness, a rare break from the chaotic pace of business. Sophie and I talked about small things, mostly the business and life in general. She was an easygoing woman, completely different from Luke's over-the-top personality, and the walk was relaxing. But as we made our way back to the cabins, I couldn't shake the feeling that something felt off. When we returned, I found Alice in surprisingly high spirits. Her earlier complaints of feeling unwell had completely vanished, and she was laughing as she stood by the kitchen counter. Luke, too, was wide awake now, sitting comfortably on the couch with an air of ease that felt unusual. He had always been a little more intense, especially when discussing work, but today he seemed lighter, almost too relaxed. "What have you been up to?" I asked, noting the odd atmosphere. "Oh, nothing much," Alice said casually with a cheerful smile. "Luke and I just watched a comedy. You know, something to pass the time while you were gone." Her tone was light, but it was the way she avoided eye contact that planted the first seed of doubt in my mind. It seemed like such an ordinary answer, something that shouldn't have triggered any alarms, but I couldn't shake the nagging feeling in my gut. Luke, always the smooth talker, added a joke about how Alice was a terrible movie critic, lightening the mood. Sophie didn't seem to notice anything, and neither did Alice, who continued to chat as though nothing was wrong. But something was wrong, at least, it felt that way. As the day went on, I couldn't help but notice how easily Alice laughed at Luke's jokes, how she seemed unusually animated around him. She had always been lively, but this felt different. It was subtle, nothing overt, but once the thought entered my mind, I found it hard to ignore. In the following weeks, that nagging feeling only grew. Alice became a little distant, not drastically, but enough for me to notice. She seemed distracted at times, often lost in thought. I tried to brush it off, telling myself that it was probably stress from work or simply a phase. After all, people go through ups and downs, right? But then there were the small absences. Alice began staying out later than usual, claiming she was out with friends or running errands that took longer than expected. I never thought of Alice as someone who would betray me, but as time passed, I found myself wondering about the moments when she wasn't around. Where was she really? Who was she spending her time with? One evening, as I sat alone in our living room, I realized something. She had stopped talking about Luke altogether. It wasn't that I expected her to bring him up regularly, but their sudden lack of interaction, at least on the surface, seemed unnatural. We had always mingled with Luke and Sophie socially, but Alice suddenly seemed disinterested in group dinners or weekend get-togethers. The change was subtle, but it was there, and it gnawed at me. I tried to shake the suspicion, telling myself that I was overthinking things, but it was impossible to ignore. I had spent years trusting Alice implicitly, but now, I found myself questioning every little detail. Could it really be nothing more than a coincidence? Or was my business partner, my so-called friend, crossing a line he shouldn't? It wasn't until a few days later that the second clue arrived, further fueling my doubts. Alice brought home a large bouquet of expensive flowers, something she had never done before. When I asked her about them, she smiled and said, "I bought these for myself. You haven't given me flowers in a while, so I thought I'd treat myself." It was a strange explanation, especially considering I had always been the one to buy her flowers on special occasions. Why now? Why this sudden gesture? The pieces of the puzzle didn't quite fit, and as much as I tried to convince myself that I was being paranoid, I couldn't escape the growing suspicion that something more was happening between Alice and Luke, something they were both hiding from me. The flowers were just the beginning. After that, my mind couldn't stop racing. Little things began to stand out, things that might have seemed innocent before, but now looked like red flags. I couldn't shake the feeling that Alice was hiding something. Worse, that Luke, my business partner and someone I thought I could at least rely on professionally, was involved. But I needed proof. Suspicion wasn't enough to confront them with. One evening, as I sat in my office late at night, I had an idea. Our company headquarters had security cameras, installed primarily to protect the business from theft or trespassing. I hadn't thought about them before, but now, the thought occurred to me: what if Alice had been meeting Luke at the office? It would explain her absences and the subtle shift in her behavior. I logged into the security system, reviewing footage from the past few weeks. At first, I saw nothing out of the ordinary, just employees coming and going, business as usual. But then, late one evening, I saw it. Alice's car, parked under the dim lights of our office parking lot, well after hours. The timestamp showed it was almost 10 p.m. My heart sank. I continued scrolling through the footage, and there it was again. A few nights later, the same thing: Alice's car in the parking lot, staying there for hours. And this time, Luke's car was parked right next to hers. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. There was no work reason for Alice to be at the office that late. She wasn't involved in the day-to-day operations of the business, and certainly not at that hour. I watched the footage over and over, hoping to catch a glimpse of them leaving together, but the cameras only covered the parking lot. Still, it was enough to make my suspicions harden into something more. The next day, I started looking for more concrete evidence. If Alice and Luke were truly involved, there had to be more signs. I didn't want to be the paranoid husband snooping through his wife's things, but at this point, I couldn't ignore the truth knocking at the door. I checked Alice's phone when she left it unattended for a brief moment. There were no suspicious texts or calls, but something made me check her email. That's when I found it. An email from Luke. It was subtle, but the tone was off. They were talking about meeting up, but it wasn't for business. Luke wrote about picking up where they left off and making sure to be discreet. I froze. The email didn't explicitly spell out an affair, but it was clear something was happening behind my back. My hands trembled as I closed her phone, my mind spinning. All the small pieces were falling into place. Alice's sudden cheerfulness after that weekend at the cabin, her absences, the flowers, and now this. But I wasn't ready to confront her, not yet. I needed something undeniable, something that couldn't be explained away as a misunderstanding. That's when I remembered Luke's office at work. He was careless with his things, always leaving his computer unlocked or his emails open. If there was more evidence, it would be there. The next day, when Luke left for a business lunch, I seized the opportunity. I slipped into his office, heart pounding, and quickly scanned his desk. Sure enough, his computer was on, and as expected, he hadn't bothered to lock it. I pulled up his email, searching through his recent messages. My breath caught in my throat when I saw a long string of emails between him and Alice, stretching back over the last few months. They weren't graphic or explicit, but the emotional intimacy was unmistakable. Luke and Alice had been meeting up regularly, sometimes at the office, sometimes at hotels. They spoke in codes, but it was easy to read between the lines. There were references to dinners, late-night meetings, and private moments that had nothing to do with business. I felt a surge of anger, followed by a wave of disbelief. My wife and my business partner had been sneaking around behind my back, betraying me in the worst way possible. The betrayal wasn't just personal, it was professional. Luke was someone I had trusted with my business, and now he was dismantling my personal life, too. I printed out the emails, feeling a grim sense of satisfaction as the evidence piled up in my hands. There was no way Alice or Luke could deny this now. It was all there, in black and white, cold, hard proof of their affair. With the evidence in hand, I left Luke's office, the reality of the situation settling in. The business, my marriage, everything I had built was crumbling around me. But now, I had what I needed to confront them both. There was no going back. I had uncovered the truth, and it was uglier than I ever could have imagined. Armed with undeniable evidence, I found myself standing at a crossroads, consumed by anger and disbelief. The betrayal from both my wife and my business partner wasn't just a blow to my personal life, it was a punch to everything I had worked so hard to build. I knew a confrontation was inevitable, but the weight of it all made me pause. I needed to time this right. I spent the next few days watching Alice closely, hoping that somehow she would offer an explanation that would make all this less painful. But she didn't. If anything, her behavior became more carefree, more detached from me and our marriage. She brought home another bouquet of flowers, this time even larger than before. When I asked her about it, she laughed and said, "You really need to start spoiling me more." "So I'm doing it myself." Her words cut deep. I knew what was really going on, but it seemed like Alice was playing a game, pretending everything was fine while she carried on behind my back. The anger that had been simmering inside me now started boiling over. Then came the day I couldn't avoid it any longer. I walked into our home office early one morning, before Alice had even woken up. I opened the drawer where we kept important papers and quietly took out the printed emails I had pulled from Luke's office. I spread them out on the desk, feeling the weight of each message. There it was, proof of their affair, documented in their own words. I waited until Alice was up, sipping coffee at the kitchen counter, completely unaware of what was about to unfold. The calm before the storm. I called her into the office, my voice steadier than I had expected. She glanced at me, a slight frown creasing her forehead, and followed me in. "What is it?" she asked, a hint of impatience in her tone. Without saying a word, I handed her the stack of printed emails. Her eyes scanned the pages, and I watched as her expression changed. The confident smile that she always carried faltered, replaced by a flash of panic. She quickly masked it, but I had seen enough. "What is this?" she asked, her voice now shaky, even though she already knew the answer. I leaned against the desk, crossing my arms. "You tell me," I said coldly, "because from where I'm standing, it looks like my wife has been meeting my business partner behind my back. It looks like you've been lying to me for months." Alice stared at the papers in her hands, her face pale. For a long moment, she didn't speak. Then, she finally looked up at me. Her eyes filled with something that resembled guilt, or maybe it was just regret at being caught. It's not what you think, she began, her voice soft but unconvincing. Luke and I, it's not serious. We didn't mean for it to happen. It just happened. I felt a bitter laugh rise in my throat. It just happened? You've been meeting him for months, Alice. In our office. In hotels. You think that's something that just happens? She shook her head, tears welling up in her eyes now. I didn't want to hurt you. I never meant. Don't. I interrupted, my voice harsh. Don't you dare say you didn't mean to hurt me. You knew exactly what you were doing. Both of you. I turned away from her, my heart pounding in my chest. The betrayal was suffocating, and for a moment, I couldn't even look at her. How could this have happened? How could the woman who had once been my biggest supporter, the person I had trusted more than anyone, do this to me? Alice started to cry softly, her tears barely audible. But I didn't feel pity. I didn't feel anything but anger and betrayal. I had spent years building a life with this woman, building a business with Luke, and in a matter of months, they had torn it all apart. We can fix this, Alice said suddenly, her voice desperate. We can go to counseling. We can try to make things right. Please, I didn't want to throw everything away. I looked at her then, finally meeting her tear-filled gaze. No, Alice, I said quietly. You already did. With those words, I walked out of the room, leaving her standing there with the crumpled papers in her hands. There was no fixing this. There was no going back. The revelation of her affair had shattered everything we had, and now, the only thing left to do was figure out how to pick up the pieces of what remained of my life. The truth had come out, and nothing would ever be the same again. After the confrontation, everything changed. The life I had carefully built, my marriage, my business, and my trust in the people closest to me began to crumble at an alarming speed. Alice tried to act as though things could go back to normal, as if a few heartfelt apologies and promises could undo the damage, but I couldn't unsee the betrayal. The woman I had shared my life with for years had torn it apart without a second thought. Every time I looked at her, all I could see was the deception in her eyes. At first, we continued living under the same roof, but the house became a war zone of silence and tension. We stopped talking about anything meaningful, limiting our interactions to hollow small talk about daily routines. Every conversation was forced, a sad performance for a marriage that had already died. Alice kept trying to fix things, suggesting we go to therapy or take a break from work to reconnect. But every time she mentioned it, it felt like she was trying to put a Band-Aid on a wound too deep to heal. The business took the next hit. My partnership with Luke was now a fragile shell of what it once was. I avoided him as much as possible, but in a company that we had built together, it was nearly impossible. Meetings became unbearable. His usual swagger, which once helped close deals and bring in clients, now felt like arrogance laced with guilt. He could tell that I knew. He must have known that it was only a matter of time before everything between us collapsed. I thought about confronting him directly, but there was something about the idea that felt too small. As much as I wanted to shout at him, punch him, and demand answers, what was the point? Luke had betrayed me, and any confrontation wouldn't change that. Instead, I distanced myself from him as much as I could while I figured out how to untangle our business. The cracks in our partnership soon became visible to everyone. Employees noticed the tension, clients began to feel the strain, and rumors spread quickly through the office. Deals we were about to close began falling apart. Potential partners started pulling out of negotiations, sensing the instability. It wasn't long before the business, once a powerhouse, began to falter. Then came the final blow. One morning, I walked into the office to find that a key client had pulled out of a massive deal at the last minute. Luke and I had been working on this project for months, and the loss was catastrophic. Without the revenue from that deal, the business's financial situation became precarious. I knew then that our partnership couldn't survive. The trust was gone, and without trust, the foundation of our business had collapsed. I called for a meeting with Luke, and for the first time since I had confronted Alice, I looked him in the eye and spoke the truth. "We're done, Luke," I said flatly, the weight of my words sinking in. "The business, the partnership, it's over. I can't work with you anymore." Luke didn't seem surprised. In fact, there was a strange relief in his expression. I knew this day was coming, he said quietly, his voice lacking the usual bravado. "But we've worked so hard. We've built something great here." "You built this with me?" I replied, my voice colder than I had ever imagined it could be. "And then you tore it all apart when you betrayed me." Luke sighed, leaning back in his chair. "I never meant for it to go this far. But it had, and now there was no salvaging what was left." We discussed the details of dissolving the company, and just like that, years of hard work unraveled. The employees would be let go, the assets would be liquidated, and the empire we had built together would be nothing more than a distant memory. Back at home, things weren't any better. Alice and I barely spoke, and each day felt like walking through a thick fog of unresolved pain. One night, she came to me, her eyes red from crying, and asked me to forgive her, to give her another chance. But I couldn't. It wasn't just the affair. It was the breach of trust, the realization that the woman I had loved for years could betray me in such a profound way. "I'm sorry, Alice," I said softly, my voice filled with finality. "But this is the end. There's nothing left between us anymore." She didn't argue. Maybe she had already known that it was over. We quietly agreed to file for divorce. As the paperwork was finalized and the dust settled, I found myself standing in the wreckage of what used to be my life. My marriage was over, my business gone, and the people I trusted most had shown me how easily everything could be destroyed. But in the midst of the fallout, I also felt something new, a strange, quiet sense of freedom. I had lost everything, but I also had the chance to rebuild, to start over without the weight of lies and betrayal hanging over me. It wasn't much, but it was a start. After the collapse of my business and the end of my marriage, I found myself consumed by a whirlwind of emotions. Anger, betrayal, and a deep sense of loss haunted me, but through it all, one emotion rose to the surface: the desire for revenge. Alice and Luke had destroyed everything I held dear, and they both carried on like nothing had happened. They deserved to feel the pain they had inflicted on me. I never thought of myself as a vengeful person, but the situation had changed me. I wasn't going to let them walk away without consequences. Luke, especially, needed to know that his betrayal had a price. He had always been ambitious, charismatic, and in control, but he didn't realize that his arrogance had left him vulnerable. Luke had a wife, Sophie, a sweet woman who had always seemed to adore him. She had been there during that weekend at the cabin, and she was as innocent in this as I had been. But as I watched my life crumble, I began to see her as a way to deliver justice. Luke had betrayed me, and it was time to make him feel that betrayal firsthand. I reached out to Sophie under the guise of business, suggesting we meet to discuss the next steps regarding the dissolution of the company. She agreed, seemingly unaware of what was really going on. We met for drinks, and it didn't take long before the conversation shifted away from business and toward our shared frustrations with Luke and Alice. We were both victims, and in that moment, our mutual pain became something more. I didn't intend for it to happen, but by the end of the evening, Sophie and I were deep into a conversation that felt intimate in ways I hadn't experienced in a long time. We shared our anger, our hurt, and in some strange way, it felt like healing. We didn't plan what happened next, but it felt inevitable. I knew it wasn't about love. It wasn't even about attraction. It was about revenge. In the weeks that followed, Sophie and I continued to see each other, but it wasn't about building a relationship. It was about letting Luke feel the same devastation I had felt. Sophie didn't need much convincing. She had always been suspicious of Luke, and when I showed her the proof of his affair with Alice, she was furious. Together, we became accomplices in each other's quest for justice. I didn't tell Alice what was happening, but I knew she suspected something. She had noticed my distance, my coldness. She tried, in her own way, to reach out to me, but it was too late. I was already gone, emotionally and mentally. My focus was on revenge now, and every time Sophie and I met, it felt like I was taking back a piece of what I had lost. Then came the moment I had been waiting for. The day Luke found out. Sophie confronted him with everything: the affair, the lies, and the fact that she and I had been meeting behind his back. The look on his face when he realized what had happened was something I'll never forget. For once, Luke, the man who always had the upper hand, was powerless. He had been beaten at his own game. Luke tried to explain, to apologize, but it was too late. His marriage with Sophie fell apart, just as mine had with Alice. And in that moment, I felt a sense of victory, knowing that he had lost everything, just as I had. But as the dust settled, I realized something unexpected. Revenge wasn't as sweet as I had imagined. Watching Luke's life crumble didn't bring me the satisfaction I thought it would. It didn't rebuild my business or heal the wound Alice had left. It didn't erase the pain. In the end, all I was left with was a hollow feeling. I had destroyed Luke's life, but in doing so, I had lost a part of myself. Sophie and I drifted apart, and I realized that our connection had only been fueled by anger and grief. There was nothing real there, just two people trying to make sense of their broken lives. With both marriages in ruins and the business gone, I found myself standing at a crossroads once again. This time, though, I wasn't fueled by rage. I was ready to move on. There was no going back, but there was also no point in living in the past anymore. I had gotten my revenge, but it hadn't brought me peace. The only resolution left was to let go, rebuild, and move forward with my life, free from the chains of betrayal. As I walked away from it all, I realized that true freedom comes not from revenge, but from finding the strength to start over. And that's exactly what I intended to do. Months passed, and I believed I had finally begun to rebuild my life. The storm of betrayal, anger, and revenge that had consumed me was starting to settle. I distanced myself from Alice and Luke, cutting off all contact, focusing instead on the future. Slowly, the chaos faded, becoming part of my past, something I hoped would remain a closed chapter. I told myself that I had survived the worst and that there was nothing left to shock me. But life had one more devastating twist in store for me. It was a gray afternoon when I received the letter. There was no return address, and the envelope was plain, except for my name scrawled hastily across the front. Immediately, I felt a twinge of unease. I knew the handwriting. It was Luke's. My pulse quickened as I hesitated, wondering what more he could possibly want after everything had fallen apart. Opening the envelope, I found a single sheet of paper with a short message. As I unfolded it, my heart pounded, and the familiar script stared back at me. I thought I had lost everything, but there's something you don't know. Alice wasn't just with me. She was seeing someone else too. Someone close to you. For a moment, I stood frozen, the words echoing in my mind. Someone else? Who could it have been? My head spun with possibilities, and a flood of memories rushed back. The moments when Alice seemed distant, the unexplained absences, the coldness that had crept into our marriage long before her affair with Luke was revealed. How had I missed it? Just as I was about to call Luke to confront him, my phone rang. It was Sophie, Luke's ex-wife. We hadn't spoken in weeks, not since our brief fling had ended, leaving us both to deal with the wreckage of our lives on our own. Her name flashing on my screen felt like another blow. I answered, but before I could say anything, her voice came through, tense and urgent. "We need to talk." "It's about Alice," she said, her voice trembling. That single sentence was enough to send my stomach into knots. I agreed to meet her, and as I hung up the phone, I felt the heavy weight of dread settle in my chest. Whatever Sophie had to say, I knew it was going to be bad, but nothing could have prepared me for what came next. We met at a small cafe, one we had been to before during the earlier days of sorting through our broken marriages. Sophie looked pale and uneasy, fidgeting with her hands as she waited for me to sit. I could tell she was nervous, more so than I had ever seen her. Without wasting any time, she leaned forward and whispered the words that would unravel everything I thought I knew. During the time Alice was with Luke, she was also seeing someone else, Sophie said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It was your younger brother." For a moment, the world around me seemed to stand still. The hum of conversation in the cafe faded into the background, and all I could hear were those words repeating over and over in my head. My younger brother. The one person I had never even considered. The betrayal struck deeper than anything I had felt before. Luke's affair with Alice had been devastating enough, but this was something far more personal, far more painful. My own blood had been involved in the deception, standing by as my life fell apart without saying a word. I couldn't breathe. My thoughts spun wildly, memories of family gatherings, dinners, holidays. Moments when I had trusted him implicitly now felt like twisted jokes. How could he have stood there, knowing everything, watching my marriage collapse, and still said nothing? Worse yet, how long had this been going on? Had it started before Luke? Had my brother been in on the lies from the beginning? I looked at Sophie, trying to find some explanation in her eyes, but all she offered was a sorrowful look. She, too, had been caught in the web of deception, just like me. Her voice cracked as she continued. I found out a few weeks ago, but I didn't know how to tell you. Anger surged inside me, hot and uncontrollable. I felt betrayed on a level I had never imagined. Luke, Alice, my brother. They had all played their part in ripping my life apart, and I had been the fool, blind to it all. I stood up abruptly, the chair scraping loudly across the floor, and walked out of the cafe, leaving Sophie behind. I needed space, time to process the enormity of what I had just learned. As I walked aimlessly through the city, my mind raced with thoughts of revenge, of confronting my brother, of finally putting an end to the lies. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that it wouldn't matter. No amount of revenge could fix the damage that had been done. The betrayal was deeper than I could ever repair, and confronting them wouldn't change anything. What was done was done. As the shock settled in, I understood that the only way forward was to let go. Luke, Alice, my brother. They had all made their choices, and those choices had destroyed the lives we once knew. But I wasn't going to let their betrayals define me any longer. There was nothing left to hold on to. Not the anger, not the revenge, not the past. It was time to truly cut ties, rebuild my life on my terms, and for the first time in a long time, finally find peace.